The room was lit by cold, gaudy lights, those typical of corporate parties, where forced smiles and empty toasts echo. I blended into the crowd, greeting familiar faces, holding a glass of wine that seemed to weigh more than it should. My gaze wandered around the room until something cut through the air like an icy dagger, laughter, the kind you recognize even in a crowded environment. She was standing there, radiant, next to a man who wasn't me. Every gesture, every touch between them, carried an intimacy that made my stomach turn. I took a deep breath, trying to rationalize. Maybe it was just a wrong impression. But the way she tilted her head, the way her fingers touched his arm, said it all. A chill ran down my spine. It wasn't an impression. It was betrayal. I can't believe you have the nerve to do that here, in front of everyone, I muttered, moving close enough for her to see me, but keeping my distance so as not to attract attention. Her eyes met mine for a brief second. There was a flash of surprise, followed by something worse, a dismissive smile. She turned her face back to him, as if I were invisible. It was there, in that instant, that I felt the weight of contempt. The wine in my hand almost slipped and a colleague passed by, tapping me lightly on the shoulder. "How are you?" he asked casually. I nodded, swallowing the answer that was burning in my throat. Because how could I explain? How could I say that I was watching my wife, the woman I had loved for so many years, humiliate me in front of the whole company without even trying to hide it? It wasn't just the physical betrayal, it was something deeper. A public demonstration that I meant nothing. They were laughing out loud now, and someone nearby commented, "They seem so connected, don't you think? He's new here, but he's already quite popular. They seem to have hit it off very well." I felt the bitter taste of bile rising, but remained silent. There was no room for a scandal at that moment. But something in me was already breaking. I kept watching. There was no looking away. Every second, the wound in my chest deepened. They were so at ease, so sure that no one would notice, or perhaps, that no one would dare to comment. I noticed furtive glances from other colleagues. They knew. Everyone knew. I decided to act. If I was going to be humiliated, let it be on my feet, not on my knees. I walked to the center of the room, near the microphone that the organizers used to announce the night's winners. My hands were shaking, but my voice, when it came out, was firm. "Good evening, everyone." The conversation stopped, and all eyes turned to me. Including hers. For the first time that evening, she looked scared. "I want to thank you all for a year of achievements and dedication. Without this team, nothing we've achieved would be possible. You're more than colleagues, you're family." I paused, letting the silence fill the room. And speaking of family, there's something I'd like to share. I looked directly at her. Her eyes were wide now, as the color began to drain from her face. He, the lover, looked uncomfortable, but tried to maintain his posture. I continued, "Sometimes, in the midst of so many responsibilities, we forget to value the people who really matter. We make mistakes, we trust blindly, and it's only when everything falls apart that we realize we may have overlooked signs that were right in front of our eyes." My voice faltered for a moment, but I recovered. "Today, I realize it's time to correct those mistakes." She started walking towards me, muttering something inaudible. But before she could reach me, I raised my hand. "I'd like to take this moment to announce something important. Something that, unfortunately, will come as a surprise to some, but necessary for others." The hall was absolutely silent. The tension was palpable. She paused, hesitating, as glances bounced between the two of us. "I've decided that I'm moving on. That it's time to close one chapter and open another." I looked directly at her. "And, to be clear, that means I'm getting divorced." The shock went through the room like a wave. Someone dropped a glass, the sound of the breaking glass echoing in the silence. She stood still, pale, while he, her lover, tried to disguise his discomfort by looking at his own shoes. I took a deep breath, feeling the weight start to lift off my shoulders. But before I could leave the makeshift stage, his voice rang out, weak but full of pleading. "Please, can we talk? Not here, not like this." She was on the verge of tears, but I could no longer feel empathy. Just a deep, cutting indifference. "Talk," I repeated, my voice laden with sarcasm. "Something we could have done before you brought your humiliation to the main stage of my life." The party had turned into a spectacle, and I was the center of attention, but this time, I didn't care. There was nothing left to lose. And as I walked out of the hall, leaving behind the chaos that my words had caused, one question kept hammering at the back of my mind: how did I get here? And perhaps, more importantly, how would it end? Because something in her gaze said that this story was far from over. What would she hide next? What would come when the masks finally fell? I knew I had to find out, but one thing was certain: I was no longer the same man who had entered that room. Welcome to the channel where masks fall and the most painful truths come to light. Here, we don't support any kind of betrayal. On the contrary, our fictional stories show how infidelity can destroy lives and leave deep scars. Each narrative is a reminder that choices have consequences. Get ready, because now you're about to hear a story that will grip you from start to finish. Take a deep breath and hold on, the impact is guaranteed. Good story. The soft glow of the sunlight reflected off the tall windows of David and Sarah's house, a building that looked like it was straight out of an architecture magazine. The modern residence, with its straight lines and neutral tones, symbolized the stability that the couple had cultivated for almost a decade. It was a carefully planned home, every detail handpicked, just as they had done with their lives, from choosing their careers to creating routines that allowed them to share responsibilities and moments together. David was the kind of man who seemed to carry the weight of the world on his shoulders, but did so with enviable calm. Always in a well-tailored suit, with impeccably combed dark hair and eyes that conveyed seriousness, he was a respected professional in the company where he worked as financial director. Despite the demanding nature of his job, he never failed to make time for Sarah, even if it was just to have a quick chat before bed. Sarah, on the other hand, was the embodiment of lightness. Blonde, with delicate features and an easy smile, she seemed to be the perfect counterpart to David's serious profile. Working as a freelance graphic designer, she had the flexibility to manage her own time, which allowed her to take care of details that made a difference to the couple's life, organizing get-togethers with friends, decorating the house for the seasons, or simply surprising David with a special dinner on an ordinary day. Their relationship was admired by many. Among their friends, they were considered the perfect couple, those who seemed to have found the formula for balancing love, work and personal ambitions. But what few noticed was the silent tension that was growing between them. It wasn't obvious, but small moments revealed almost imperceptible cracks. The way Sarah sometimes looked away during more serious conversations, or the way David spent more time in the office than before, details that seemed insignificant in everyday life, but which, taken together, told a story of a slow drift apart. The setting in which this story unfolded was a city in constant motion, with wide streets and tall buildings housing thousands of people racing against time. For David, the city was a corporate battlefield, where every day brought new challenges. For Sarah, it was an inexhaustible source of inspiration, with its cozy cafes, lively parks and vibrant cultural events. Despite being surrounded by so many possibilities, the routine ended up consuming them in different ways. Their friendship was solid, but recently it seemed that something had changed. David, always so attentive, now seemed distracted, as if he was carrying a worry that he couldn't share. Sarah, who used to be the first to notice any change in his behavior, also seemed immersed in her own thoughts, sometimes more distant than usual. "How was your day?" David asked one evening as he took off his tie and left his shoes in the corner of the living room. Sarah was in the kitchen, stirring a pot of soup that seemed to be her standard response to long days. "Quiet," she replied, without taking her eyes off the stove. "I managed to finish the project for that store I told you about." David nodded, but didn't reply immediately. He walked into the kitchen, picked up a glass of wine and poured them both a glass. "Good to hear that. You deserve a break after all that work." Sarah's smile seemed genuine, but it didn't reach her eyes. He noticed, but didn't comment. The two sat down to dinner, and the conversation flowed superficially, with both avoiding touching on deeper subjects. It was as if there was a silent pact to keep things light, even if the atmosphere was charged with something neither of them could name. Despite the lukewarm interactions, there were moments that still showed glimpses of the couple they used to be. The previous weekend, they had gone for a walk in the park, and for a moment, between giggles about an old memory, it seemed that nothing had changed. But, like the sun disappearing over the horizon, that moment passed quickly, leaving behind an emptiness that neither of them could fill. The differences between them began to be accentuated in the small details. David, for example, was more dedicated to his work, justifying his desire to ensure a comfortable future for both of them. Sarah, on the other hand, immersed herself in creative projects that kept her busy, but not necessarily happy. The feeling that they were living parallel lives, rather than a shared journey, became increasingly evident. Close friends noticed the change, although they didn't say anything directly. "They're so busy," someone commented over dinner. Another friend replied with an uncertain smile, "Well, every marriage goes through ups and downs, doesn't it?" And so the subject was brushed aside, as if ignoring it was the solution. However, the truth was that they both felt the absence of something, but didn't know how to express it. Sarah, in moments of introspection, wondered if she was still enough for David. He, in turn, wondered if she still saw him as the man she had chosen to spend her life with. These questions weren't spoken out loud, but they were always there, like shadows that accompanied them wherever they went. Meanwhile, life went on, and everyday commitments filled the spaces between them. David's company party was approaching, and he had insisted that Sarah accompany him. "It'll be good to get out for a while. Maybe we'll have some fun," he said, trying to sound more excited than he felt. Sarah hesitated, but eventually agreed. Perhaps it would be an opportunity to reconnect, to remember why they had chosen each other. She had spent days planning what to wear, wanting to impress him, but also looking for something to give him back the confidence that seemed to have been lost. David, on the other hand, barely had time to think about the party, busy with deadlines and endless meetings. On the night of the event, they both looked impeccable. Sarah, in an elegant black dress, looked the very definition of grace and sophistication. David, in his usual suit, exuded confidence, but his eyes showed fatigue. When they arrived at the venue, they were greeted by work colleagues, and for a moment, everything seemed normal. They laughed, toasted and chatted as they did in the early years of their marriage. But even in that festive atmosphere, the tension between them was palpable. Exchanged glances, unspoken words, and an invisible distance that neither of them knew how to shorten. It was as if they were dancing on a tightrope, trying to keep their balance without knowing where they were going. What neither of them knew was that that night would be the start of an irreversible change in their lives. The party, which seemed to be just another corporate event, would become the stage for revelations and decisions that would put everything they had built together to the test. And while they were trying to navigate the smiles and false greetings of the evening, fate was already preparing the next act, waiting patiently to crumble what was left of that carefully maintained facade. The company party was in full swing when David and Sarah arrived. The sound of laughter and toasting glasses echoed through the room decorated with understated luxury, a reflection of the company's prosperity. Sarah felt a mixture of anxiety and excitement as she walked across the entrance carpet. Her dress sparkled under the lights, and she knew she was attracting stares. David, by her side, looked as impeccable as ever, but there was something about his posture that made him distant, as if he were there only out of obligation. They circulated around the hall, greeting familiar faces. David was well received, his colleagues making friendly jokes and casting admiring glances at Sarah, who always knew how to captivate a room. However, while David seemed to interact out of duty, Sarah stood out in a genuine way. She was engaging, with a smile that lit up the room, but behind it, I sensed a growing unease, as if she was playing a role she no longer fully believed in. As the evening progressed, David got involved in more serious business conversations, while Sarah wandered around the hall. She came across a group of executives' wives and, for a few minutes, tried to connect, but felt out of place. This was common for her at events like this, but that night it seemed more difficult than ever. The laughter around her sounded artificial, and she found herself increasingly looking at her watch, wishing the night would end. That's when Sarah noticed a steady gaze coming from across the room. It was a man she didn't recognize, but he seemed familiar somehow. Tall, well-dressed and with an air of confidence, he smiled at her with a disconcerting naturalness. Sarah looked away, but felt her face flush. It was the kind of attention she hadn't received for a long time and, as much as she tried to ignore it, there was something magnetic about that moment. Later, while David was busy talking to a colleague, the mysterious man approached. "You look out of place," he commented with an easy smile. Sarah smiled back, feeling uncomfortable but intrigued. "Maybe a little. These parties always leave me feeling a bit bored," she replied, trying to keep the conversation casual. "I see. I'm not exactly a fan of these kinds of events either, but sometimes they're unavoidable," he said, holding out his hand. "I'm Eric, a new manager here." "And you're?" "Sarah," she replied, hesitantly. "David's wife." Eric smiled again, but this time with an intensity that sent a chill down Sarah's spine. "Of course. I've heard a lot about him. He seems to be a very respected man." His tone was friendly, but there was something in his words that Sarah couldn't quite decipher. They talked for a few minutes, and Sarah was surprised at how comfortable she felt. Eric was charismatic, and his relaxed manner contrasted with the seriousness she usually encountered at events like this. She tried to remember the last time she had laughed so spontaneously in a conversation, but couldn't. David appeared soon after, and Sarah quickly turned away from Eric, feeling a sudden guilt she couldn't explain. David didn't seem to notice anything out of the ordinary and simply suggested they get something to drink. Sarah agreed, but as they walked, she felt Eric's gaze following her around the room. The evening continued, but something had changed for Sarah. She couldn't get Eric out of her mind. It wasn't just his conversation or his smile, it was the feeling of being seen, of being noticed in a way she hadn't experienced for a long time. It was intoxicating, and no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't get her mind off it. Meanwhile, David seemed increasingly absorbed in his own worries. He isolated himself in conversations about goals and future projects, ignoring the signs of disconnection between him and Sarah. When he looked at her, he saw a beautiful and devoted wife, but he didn't notice the subtle changes in her expression, the signs of an internal battle she was fighting. A few days after the party, Sarah received an unexpected message. It was from Eric. He had gotten her number from a mutual colleague, and the tone of the message was casual but direct. "I enjoyed talking to you at the party. Maybe we can pick up where we left off sometime." Sarah hesitated for hours before replying, but the temptation was stronger. She justified to herself that it was just an innocent conversation, nothing more. But as the messages became more frequent, she felt something awakening inside her, something that had been dormant for a long time. David, on the other hand, didn't notice the changes in Sarah. He was overwhelmed with work, and the few moments they spent together were filled with comfortable but empty silences. He had no idea that while he worked late, Sarah spent hours on the phone, laughing and sharing secrets with Eric. Time passed, and the relationship between Sarah and Eric evolved from messaging to discreet encounters. The first coffee was harmless, but the second, third and all those that followed were marked by growing tension. Sarah knew she was crossing a line, but she couldn't stop. There was something about Eric that made her heart soar, something she hadn't felt since the early years with David. The moment of betrayal came almost inevitably. A meeting that should have been brief stretched on for hours, until they found themselves in a more private place. Sarah felt a mixture of guilt and excitement consume her. When she finally gave in to the impulse, she knew she had broken something that could never be repaired. On returning home that evening, Sarah found David on the sofa, working on his laptop. He looked at her and smiled, oblivious to the whirlwind of emotions she was facing. "How was your day?" he asked casually. Sarah only replied with a whisper, unable to face him. But what Sarah didn't know was that David was beginning to get suspicious. Little signs that he had previously ignored now caught his attention, messages that she quickly deleted, outings that made no sense, and an air of distraction that she couldn't hide. He wasn't sure what was going on, but something inside him told him that his world was about to fall apart. The silence in the dining room was deafening. David and Sarah were sitting at the table, but the space between them seemed larger than ever. The food was cooling on their untouched plates. Sarah looked down at her hands, feeling the weight of David's gaze, which remained fixed on her. He didn't say anything, but the tension in his expression said more than any words. She tried to break the silence. "You've been acting strange lately. Is something bothering you?" David leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. The calculated calm in his voice sounded almost like a whisper, but each word carried a weight that made Sarah shudder. "I think the more appropriate question would be, what's bothering you, Sarah?" Sarah frowned, trying to understand. "I don't know what you're talking about." "You don't?" He laughed humorlessly, shaking his head. "I've been watching you, your timetables, your excuses. Sarah, do you think I'm that naive?" She felt her heart racing. "David, what are you trying to say? If you have something to say it at once." David propped his elbows on the table and looked straight into her eyes. "You're having an affair, aren't you?" The question cut through the air like a blade, leaving Sarah speechless. For a moment, she wanted to deny it, but she knew it would be useless. He already knew. There was no escaping it. Breathing heavily, she looked away. I don't know how to explain it." David snorted, his voice becoming firmer. "You don't know how to explain? You can't explain why you've destroyed everything we've built together. Why did you decide to stab me in the back? I never wanted to hurt you." Sarah exploded, tears starting to roll down her face. I lost myself, David. I don't know how it happened." David stood up, pushing his chair back hard. He began to pace around the room, rubbing his temples as if trying to organize his thoughts. "Don't you know how it happened? You chose this, Sarah. You chose every message, every meeting, every lie." Sarah stood up too, approaching hesitantly. "David, please. It wasn't supposed to be like this. I was feeling so alone, and you think I wasn't lonely," he interrupted her, his voice rising a tone. "I worked my butt off to make sure we didn't lack anything. So that we had a comfortable life. Do you know how hard I worked, how much I sacrificed?" "I know." Sarah shouted, clutching his arms. "I know, but I sacrificed too. We've both lost something along the way." David pushed her away gently but firmly, looking at her as if for the first time. "And that's why you decided to seek comfort in the arms of another man? Is that how you resolve things?" Sarah was sobbing now, unable to answer. David watched her, but what had once been anger now seemed to be something deeper. Disgust. Disappointment. He took a deep breath and spoke again, this time in a more controlled tone. "I wanted to put things right. You knew that. I tried. I tried everything. And what about you? What did you do?" Sarah tried to answer, but the words wouldn't come out. She knew there wasn't enough justification, not for that. "I'm sorry. I really am. Being sorry doesn't change anything, Sarah." He took a step back, as if he needed room to breathe. "But that's not what's really bothering me now. It's the other part." Sarah looked at him in confusion, wiping away her tears with the back of her hand. What do you mean? David crossed his arms again, his expression hardening. The lover. Eric, right? You knew he worked for the same company as me. You knew he wasn't just some random stranger. Or did you think I wouldn't realize that too? Sarah remained silent, and the blush on her face showed that David was right. Did you think you could keep everything a secret, that I'd never find out? David continued, his voice now a little louder. Did you think I was so blind as not to notice? She swallowed, trying to think of something to say, but nothing seemed appropriate. David turned to her, his eyes fixed on hers, full of something Sarah had never seen before. I found out, Sarah. And it wasn't by chance. It was because he made a mistake. What mistake? She finally managed to ask, her voice almost a whisper. David walked over to the table and picked up an envelope, throwing it in front of her. This mistake. Sarah opened the envelope with trembling hands and found copies of documents, emails, and financial records. She was breathless as her eyes ran over the pages. It was much more than she had expected. What is this? She asked, even though she knew the answer. This, Sarah, is proof that Eric was using you to get close to me. He didn't care about you. He wanted what I had, my position, my prestige. And he thought you were the easiest way to get it. Sarah's eyes filled with tears again, but this time it wasn't just guilt. It was humiliation. She felt used, betrayed in a way she had never imagined. David continued, mercilessly. While you thought you were living some kind of forbidden romance, he was manipulating you. He needed information, Sarah. Information that you handed over on a plate. And thanks to that, he almost managed to ruin the company. Sarah shook her head, disbelief evident on her face. I didn't know, you didn't know because you didn't want to know. David took a step closer, his voice low but cutting. You were so caught up in your fantasy that you ignored what was right in front of you. She tried to say something, but words failed her. The weight of the truth was crushing her, and all she could do was stand there in silence, staring at the ground. David sighed, his anger beginning to give way to a deep weariness. You destroyed much more than our marriage, Sarah. You put everything at risk. And for what? For something that wasn't even real. He took a few steps towards the door, stopping before he left. I'm leaving for now. I need time to think about what to do next. But know this, I don't trust you anymore. And I don't know if I ever will again. Sarah fell to the floor, unable to hold back her tears. The sound of the door closing echoed through the empty house, leaving her alone with her choices and their consequences. David left the house and got into his car, but didn't start the engine. Sitting in the silence of the vehicle, he gripped the steering wheel so hard that his knuckles turned white. The weight of what had just happened was almost unbearable. He knew he needed air, space, but he also knew that, somehow, it was far from over. His thoughts were a whirlwind, Sarah's betrayal, Eric's manipulations, and the fragility of everything he thought was solid in his life. Determined not to spend the night at home, David drove aimlessly through dimly lit streets until he stopped in front of a small bar he used to frequent in the early years of their marriage. He went in, chose a table in the corner and ordered a whiskey. As the liquid burned down his throat, he wondered at exactly what point his life had started to fall apart. Deep down, he knew that the problems with Sarah hadn't started with Eric. The distance between them had been growing for years, but he had never imagined that things could come to this. He took another sip, his thoughts interrupted by the insistent vibration of the phone in his pocket. He looked at the screen and saw Sarah's name. He hesitated before rejecting the call. He wasn't ready to hear any more from her, not that night. On the other side, Sarah was sitting in the living room, staring into the void. The phone still in her hand trembled with the rejection of the call. She knew she had crossed a line she could no longer get back from, but she didn't know how to fix what she had done. The weight of David's words still echoed in her mind, especially the revelation that Eric had used her. It was a different pain from the guilt she already felt, it was the pain of feeling cheated and discarded. Picking up her phone again, she typed a message to David, "We need to talk. I can't leave it like this. Please come home." She sent it and waited, the phone in her hand like an anchor. But no sound came, no answer. Meanwhile, David was finishing his second whiskey when a familiar voice interrupted his thoughts. "You look like you could use a good talking to." He looked up and saw Mark, an old friend and work colleague he hadn't seen for years. Mark sat down uninvited and ordered himself a drink. "What's going on, man? You look like shit." David laughed humorlessly, shaking his head. "It's complicated." "Complicated, I know that word well. But sometimes talking helps. Do you want to try?" David hesitated, but Mark's frankness encouraged him. He summed up the situation quickly and directly, without going into the most painful details. Mark listened in silence, his gaze serious but empathetic. When David had finished, his friend sighed and shook his head. "That's heavy, man. But if you ask me, you need to decide whether you're going to fight for something or leave it all behind. Because staying in the middle of it will only destroy you." David absorbed the words, feeling torn. He was grateful for Mark's company, but he knew that no amount of talking would change what he needed to do. He needed to confront Eric. It was the only way to close that chapter. The next day, David arrived at the office early. The silence of the place was almost disturbing, and he used that to his advantage. He knew Eric would be arriving soon, and he wanted to be prepared. When Eric finally entered, his confident countenance contrasted with the storm David was carrying. "Eric, I need a word with you," David said, his voice controlled but laden with clear intentions. Eric hesitated for a moment, but nodded. They headed for an empty meeting room. As soon as the door closed, David turned to him, his eyes burning with anger. "Did you really think you could use my wife to get to me? That I wouldn't find out?" David began, his voice firm but low enough to maintain secrecy. Eric raised his eyebrows, feigning surprise. "David, I don't know what you're talking about." "Don't play the fool," David snapped. He took the envelope out of his briefcase and threw it on the table. "I've got everything here. Emails, messages, proof that you were trying to manipulate company information through her." For a moment, Eric said nothing, but his smile began to fade. He looked at the papers and then back at David. "And what are you going to do with that?" David leaned forward, his eyes fixed on Eric. "That's up to you. I could end your career right now. But I want to know why. Why her? Why do it?" Eric shrugged, a cynical smile appearing on his lips. "Because it was easy. She was needy, vulnerable. You know that, don't you? You neglected her, and I just took advantage of the opportunity." Eric's words were like a punch in the gut, but David kept his composure. "Do you think this is a game? That people are disposable pieces for you to use as you please?" Eric crossed his arms, relaxing in his chair. "Welcome to the real world, David. Business is business. And relationships? Well, they're just complications along the way." David felt a boiling anger rise up in him, but he knew he couldn't let himself get carried away. He took a deep breath, keeping control. "You're a despicable man. But I'll deal with you the right way." He took the envelope, put it back in his briefcase and headed for the door. Before leaving, he turned once more. "Oh, and what about Sarah? She doesn't deserve your attention anymore. Consider that a final warning." Eric didn't reply, but the cynical smile on his face began to fade when he realized that David was serious. As David left the room, he felt a weight come off his shoulders. But he knew that the conversation with Sarah would be even more difficult. On returning home that evening, David found Sarah in the living room, waiting for him. She seemed to have aged years in just one day, her face marked by guilt and regret. Before he could say anything, she began to speak. "David, I need you to know that nothing that's happened means that I've stopped loving you. I made terrible mistakes, but Eric, he was an illusion. I was foolish and weak, but I never meant to hurt you like that." David sat on the sofa, looking at her with an exhausted expression. "I confronted Eric today. And he confirmed what I already knew. He was using you." Sarah choked, tears filling her eyes again. "I didn't know. I swear I didn't know. I was an idiot." "Yes, you were," David replied, the honesty in his voice cutting. "But what really matters now is what comes next. Because I don't know if I can move on with you after all this." Sarah fell to her knees, crying openly. "Please give me a chance to fix this. I'll do anything." David watched her for a long moment before replying. "I don't know, Sarah. I really don't know. But one thing's for sure, I won't let you or anyone else destroy me again." He stood up, leaving Sarah alone, his words echoing through the silence of the house. They both knew that nothing would ever be the same. The future was uncertain, but the weight of what they had lost was something they would have to carry forever. The house was silent again. Sarah remained kneeling on the living room floor, unable to move. The sound of the door closing behind David had echoed throughout the empty space, like a sign that something irrevocable had happened. She breathed with difficulty, feeling her chest tighten, as if the very air was leaving her. After a while, she slowly stood up, walked over to the sofa and let herself fall onto it, hugging a cushion as if it were the only thing keeping her upright. Her thoughts were in a whirl. It wasn't just the fear of losing David, but also the guilt of having allowed someone like Eric into her life and corrupting her in ways she had never imagined. Meanwhile, David drove along the dark road, his hands firm on the wheel, but his heart heavy. The conversation with Sarah had been the closing of a chapter, but the pain didn't subside. He felt a mixture of anger, sadness and, above all, exhaustion. How had it come to this? At what point had his marriage, something he considered so solid, become so fragile? With no clear direction, he ended up in front of his sister Emily's house. She was one of the few people he trusted unconditionally. When he rang the doorbell, it was just after 11 at night. Emily opened the door with a worried look on her face. "David? Is everything all right?" He shook his head, his eyes full of tiredness. "Can I come in?" Emily nodded, making room for him. The moment he crossed the threshold, she knew something serious had happened. They sat down in the kitchen and David began to talk. He told her everything, from Sarah's betrayal to Eric's manipulation. Emily listened in silence, her expression alternating between shock and empathy. "David, I don't know what to say," she began, after a long silence. "You have every right to be angry. Anyone would be. But, what do you want to do now?" That was the question he couldn't answer. "I don't know, Emily. Part of me wants to just end it all, but another part still remembers who Sarah was before all this. Who we were." Emily put her hand over his. "You don't have to decide anything now. Take all the time you need. But, David, whatever you decide, make sure it's something you can live with." He remained silent, absorbing her words. After a while, he decided he needed a little rest. Emily prepared the guest room, and he lay down, but sleep didn't come. He stared at the ceiling, revisiting every moment of their marriage, trying to understand where everything had started to fall apart. The next morning, Sarah woke up alone in the house. David's absence was like a hole in the room, impossible to ignore. She tried to call him, but the phone went straight to voicemail. Feeling helpless, she decided to write a letter. She took pen and paper and began to pour out her thoughts, trying to find the right words to explain the inexplicable. "David, I don't know where to start. Words seem too small to express what I'm feeling. I know I've let you down in a way that may never be fixed, but I need you to know that I never wanted it to be like this. I lost myself, and in my weakness, I made choices that destroyed what we had. You didn't deserve that. I know I don't have the right to ask for forgiveness, but I hope that one day you'll be able to see me again, beyond the mistakes I made." She read and reread the letter several times before folding it up and putting it in an envelope. She didn't know if David would read it, but she had to try. She left the envelope on the table and spent the rest of the day wandering around the house, lost in her own thoughts. Meanwhile, David decided that he needed to face the situation more clearly. He arranged a meeting with the company's board to discuss Eric's involvement. Although it was a personal matter, Eric's actions had crossed the line between the professional and the personal, and David knew he needed to protect his position and the integrity of the organization. The meeting was tense, but decisive. With the evidence in hand, David managed to convince the board to take action against Eric, who was immediately removed from his position. The relief of seeing justice done was short-lived, as the weight of his personal life still hung over him. After the meeting, David returned to Emily's house. Sitting in the small garden at the back of the house, he watched the leaves falling from the trees, a reminder of the inevitable cycle of things. Emily appeared with 2 cups of coffee and sat down next to him. "You've done what you had to do," she said, handing him one of the cups. "Now you just have to decide what to do about Sarah." David sighed, bringing the cup to his lips. "She's no longer who I knew her to be, Emily. Or maybe she was never who I thought she was. But, part of me still loves her. And that's the hardest thing." Emily nodded, understanding the complexity of his dilemma. Loving someone doesn't mean accepting everything they do. But it also doesn't mean you have to erase everything you've lived through together. While David pondered Emily's words, Sarah was at home, looking at the letter she had written. She knew she would need to do more than words to win back David's trust, but she didn't know where to start. She decided to call Emily, knowing that she could have some influence on him. Emily answered with a mixture of surprise and caution. "Sarah, what do you want?" "Emily, I know I don't have the right to ask for anything, but, please, can you talk to David? I just want him to read the letter. That's all I'm asking." Emily hesitated for a moment before replying. "I can't promise anything, but I'll talk to him." That evening, Emily handed David the envelope. He looked at the letter with an indecipherable expression, but didn't open it immediately. "Did she ask you to give this to me?" "Yes. But what you do with it is up to you. I just thought you should have the chance to decide." David put the envelope in his pocket and went upstairs to his room. He stared at the letter for a long time before finally opening it and starting to read. Sarah's words were sincere, full of regret and vulnerability. For the first time, he felt that maybe there was a small chance of understanding, even if forgiveness still seemed far away. He closed the letter and stared out of the window at the horizon. He knew he had to make a decision soon, but that choice still seemed impossible. The only thing he knew was that, somehow, his life would never be the same again. The morning arrived cold and silent. David was still sitting at the kitchen table in Emily's house, Sarah's letter open in front of him. Reading it had shaken him, but not in a way he could easily describe. Her words were honest, full of regret, but he still didn't know if they were enough. Trust, once broken, was not easily regained. He took a sip of his cold coffee and stared into the void. What to do with it all? He knew he needed to go home, but not to get back together or to seek immediate reconciliation. He needed to face Sarah one last time, close the loop and make a definitive decision. He grabbed his coat and, before leaving, told Emily he would be back later. She just nodded, understanding that he needed space. When he got home, the atmosphere seemed charged. Sarah was in the living room, her eyes fixed on the window, as if waiting for him. When the door opened, she turned immediately, hope and fear stamped on her expression. David entered without saying a word, hung up his coat and sat down in the armchair opposite her. The silence between them was almost tangible. "Did you read my letter?" she finally asked, her voice low, almost a whisper. David nodded. I did. And I realize that you're sorry. But regret doesn't undo what happened. Sarah looked away, holding back the tears that threatened to fall. I know that. But I don't know how to live with what I've done. I made so many mistakes, David, but it was never because I didn't love you. It was because I lost myself. David sighed wearily. Do you think that's enough to make everything right? To admit that you made a mistake? Love is not an excuse, Sarah. It's not a shield that protects against all bad decisions. You chose to betray me. You chose to destroy what we had. She sobbed, but kept her gaze fixed on his. I know. And I don't expect you to forgive me now, maybe never. But I want you to know that I'm willing to do anything to try to fix what's left of us. David was silent for a long time, his emotions oscillating between anger, sadness, and a twinge of compassion that he didn't want to feel. I don't know if there is still an us, Sarah. I really don't know. But I do know that I have to move on, one way or another. The words came as a blow to Sarah, but she knew he was right. She nodded slowly, trying to accept what seemed inevitable. I'll keep the house for now, David continued. You can look for another place. I'll help you with whatever you need, but I need space. Sarah agreed, knowing that insisting wouldn't change anything. They spent the rest of the day in an uncomfortable silence while she began to pack some things. When night fell, she left with a small suitcase, glancing at him one last time before closing the door. Thanks for at least listening to me, she said, and then left. In the days that followed, David began to rebuild his routine. He threw himself into work, but he also made time for himself, something he hadn't done for a long time. He started running in the park, something he used to enjoy before the wedding. It was during one of these runs that he met someone unexpected. On a cold Saturday morning, while running, David tripped and almost fell. A woman who was also running stopped to help him. Are you all right? She asked, concerned. David laughed, a little embarrassed. I think my coordination skills need a bit of work. She smiled, holding out her hand. I'm Rachel. And you? David, he replied, shaking her hand. The connection was immediate, something light but genuine. They started chatting as they continued running together, and David felt something he hadn't felt for a long time, lightness. Meanwhile, Sarah dedicated herself to trying to understand her own mistakes. She began to go to therapy, confronting the deep-seated reasons that had led her to cheat. She discovered old wounds that had never been healed, insecurities that had been with her all her life. It was a painful but necessary process. She knew that, whatever happened to David, she needed to be a better person for herself. Eric, on the other hand, didn't have such a smooth outcome. After being fired from the company, he tried to maintain his arrogant attitude, but the doors began to close. The reputation he had cultivated so much was tarnished by the revelations of his actions, and he realized, too late, that he had underestimated David. Left with no options, he ended up taking a job far below his former position, something that deeply wounded his ego. A few months later, David and Rachel started seeing each other more often. What began as a friendship evolved into something more. She was different from Sarah, but not in the sense of being better or worse. Rachel made him laugh, brought lightness to his life, something he didn't even know he needed. Little by little, David began to realize that it was possible to rebuild, that the wounds of the past didn't have to define him forever. Sarah, for her part, found new strength in her journey of self-knowledge. She knew that her marriage to David was a part of the past, but that didn't mean her life was over. She started giving talks about overcoming mistakes, turning her story into something that could help other people avoid the same paths. One day, while walking in the park, Sarah saw David in the distance. He was with Rachel, and the two of them were laughing together, looking happy. Sarah felt a twinge of sadness, but also a sense of peace. She knew that, even if they couldn't rebuild what they had, they were both moving on, in ways that made sense to them. David looked at her for a moment and nodded. Sarah returned the nod, a small but sincere smile on her lips. Without words, they recognized that, despite everything, life went on. And so they each went their separate ways, taking the lessons they had learned and rebuilding their lives as best they could. Because, in the end, that's what mattered, moving on, even after everything. If you've made it this far, let us know in the comments what you thought of this story. Your opinion is very important. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss out on future stories. And remember, this channel does not support any kind of betrayal. Betrayal destroys lives and leaves deep scars. See you next time.